As the war in Ukraine escalates, the Biden administration sends $20 billion in aid to Kiev ahead of a new Trump presidency. But can there be a military solution to the conflict?
Nobody wants more peace than Ukraine. Finland wants peace. Everybody wants peace. The only ones who do not want peace and who started the war in the first place is Russia. And unfortunately, the more you give in to Russian aggression, the more of the aggression you get.
As Finland and other NATO members continue to provide weapons to Ukraine, will their military support enhance regional and global security, or will it create more instability? Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Rida Fakhri. Today we turn our focus to the war in Ukraine as key members of NATO, the US and UK, push for more military support for Kiev. The Ukrainian president recently proposed allowing foreign troops to be deployed to Ukraine until his country joins the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. Meanwhile, the incoming US President Donald Trump has renewed his threat to pull out of the Western alliance. But one small Nordic nation has reaffirmed its commitment to NATO as it moves away from its decades-old policy of non-alignment. Last December, Helsinki signed a bilateral defense cooperation agreement with the United States, giving US forces access to 15 sites across Finland, including airfields, a naval base and other military infrastructure near the Russian border. In a moment, we'll be speaking with Finland's Foreign Minister Elina Valtonen, but first a look at the current stakes in Ukraine for NATO members.
Finland and Sweden joined NATO because of Russia's attack on Ukraine.
We must do more than just keep Ukraine in the fight. We must provide enough support to change the trajectory of this conflict once and for all.
President Biden is committed to making sure that every dollar we have at our disposal will be pushed out the door between now and January 20th.
I think it's absolutely the case that Ukraine's rightful place is within the NATO family.
We need peace in Ukraine. For that, we need Russia to stop shelling, which they are not doing.
The United States continues to pump the virtually illegitimate regime in Kiev with weapons and money to send mercenaries and military advisors and to encourage further escalation of the conflict.
As one of NATO's most recent and committed members, Finland is seeking to play the role of security provider for the alliance. Sharing a 1,300-kilometer border with Russia, could Finland's assertive military role lead to more or less security and stability in the Baltic region? Joining us now is Finland's Foreign Minister Elina Valtonen, a key architect of Finland's strengthened ties with NATO. Foreign Minister Valtonen, you chaired Finland's delegation to NATO when it joined the alliance. At the time, very few thought that Finland would take this step after decades of non-alignment and neutrality. Why did you join?
In the end, it wasn't a massive step to take for Finland in the sense that we had been closely cooperating with NATO over years and even decades up to the point to the fact that we were almost 100% interoperable with NATO as it stood. But perhaps Finns thought that we don't need the NATO membership. We had close cooperation, of course, across the region, obviously being members in the European Union, being bound by the solidarity clauses within the European Union as well. And we had very close defense cooperation, for instance, with the likes of Sweden. But everything changed when Russia started the full-scale invasion of Ukraine.
But critics have argued that by joining NATO, you have essentially doubled NATO's border with Russia, and that instead of being something that adds to the security of the region, it is actually something that could increase the possibility of confrontation.
Well, for us, this long border is nothing new, and we have been preparing for any eventualities over the course of the years and decades. And unfortunately, yes, we have been facing Russian aggression in the past quite so many times, which has led to the fact that Finland has had and still has one of the strongest armies in Europe. And I'm speaking in absolute terms, not just relative terms. So we do see that we are net contributors to the alliance together with Sweden. Obviously, we are both spending well above 2% into defense. And Finland also has a conscription-based army, which means that if need be, then, we have quite many troops to send for our common defense.
Finland joining NATO may have been a major blow for Russia in the Baltics, but doesn't membership within NATO bring another burden for you, for Finland, another risk, given its close proximity to Russia?
I think what comes to the Baltic countries, Estonia, Lithuania, and Latvia, we would have felt a very strong urgency to help those countries anyway if there had been any aggression from Russia, because those countries do share the same values with us in the Nordics, with Sweden, Finland, Norway, Denmark, and Iceland. We feel very strongly bound. So I guess now it's just so much easier that we are within the same alliance. And now I'm only speaking for the region around the Baltic Sea, also consisting of course, Germany and Poland, next to the countries I already mentioned. So it's very important that we have this high level of urgency, wanting to help each other out if something happens. But also being in NATO means that we are already in the same command structure, we are in the same defense plans, which not only helps in the case where we really had to defend ourselves, but also it acts very much as deterrence.
You mentioned deterrence. Others might see it as provocation, because for years, if not decades, following the Second World War, Finland adopted a position of active neutrality in the shadow of Soviet influence. That led to a long period of stability and peace. By charting this new course, could you be moving away from that sort of stability into a conflict situation again with Russia?
Finnish and Swedish NATO memberships add to the stability of the region. And I would not see this as any type of provocation because, first of all, NATO is a defensive alliance, and Finland obviously has never shown any aggression towards Russia. We just want to live in peace, and we are ready and able to defend ourselves if need be. But otherwise, we would so much hope for increased freedoms and a democratic society in Russia as well, with whom we would so much like to engage also economically. Like, well, the rest of us in Europe, we did all sorts of engagement with Russia, even after they had illegally annexed Crimea. But after the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, well, we just had to close those ties. But this is only the responsibility of Russia, who is the aggressor. And also, speaking for Ukraine, of course, Ukraine didn't provoke Russia. They did not pose a threat to Russia. They just wanted to live in peace and develop their society. But then Russia attacked.
If Ukraine was to adopt a position of neutrality and non-alignment, just like Finland did after the Second World War, could it lead to a more peaceful coexistence with Russia, which shares a long border with Finland, just as it worked for you back then? Could it work for Ukraine today?
A couple of things have to be said. First of all, I'm not in a position to tell Ukraine what Ukraine is supposed to do. It's only up to the Ukrainians to decide that. Second thing, back in early 1940s, when first we had defended our country against the aggression from the back then Soviet Union, there was no United Nations, there was no United Nations Charter who stipulates that every sovereign nation has the right to territorial integrity and sovereignty. So if we were, or if somebody were to impose this clause for Ukraine, that they couldn't be a free nation, that they should give up some territory only because another country has used violence against them, then effectively we are abandoning the UN Charter. And finally, what has to be said, Ukraine was neutral and militarily non-aligned before Russia attacked. So I guess even that doesn't help. On the very contrary, it seems that Russia very much likes to re-establish its spheres of influence, which have nothing to do with today's existence, and especially the rights of people to decide for themselves. So together we just have to oppose that aggression and rely on the UN Charter and international law.
You just mentioned the importance of countries to decide for themselves what they see fit, but we know that some Western countries actually imposed their own will on Ukraine, and Zelensky, who was on the verge of signing an agreement with Russia back in April of 2022, when the UK Prime Minister at the time, Boris Johnson, flew in and urged the Ukrainians to carry on fighting. To what end?
I don't think there's any evidence of such events taking place. And even if it was, then at the end of the day, it's up to the Ukrainians to decide. It is the Ukrainian soldiers who are fighting for the future of their own country with the help of many countries. And first of all, it is exactly according to international law and the UN Charter that the sovereign country may defend itself. And also, it is also adherent to international law if other countries wish to help such a country who has been attacked. So there's only one country who is violating international law in this case, and that is unfortunately Russia.
But the war has gone on for almost 3 years now. There has been enormous devastation in Ukraine, hundreds of thousands of casualties. What is the end game if there is no political settlement? Because clearly this cannot be won on the battlefield.
I'm not here to predict the future, and neither am I a person to tell you what the end game is for this brutal war. What has to be said is that, first of all, the Russian war economy is cracking as we speak. So it is extremely important that we keep on imposing the sanctions pressure because, well, if a country is blatantly ignoring and violating international law, then this simply is the only tool that we have, because of course we want to adhere to the same law and the UN Charter. And the second thing is aiding Ukraine, which we have the rightful thing to do. And I would even say as humans, we have the duty to do that, because if Ukraine would have to surrender, then I guess this would have global implications. Every country around the world would have to fear another reckless, aggressive neighbor. It doesn't even have to be a neighbor. We've seen Russian aggression across European countries who are not neighboring Russia. So effectively, it would bring us to a totally different world.
But what is the alternative? More of the same, more death and devastation? Finland's aid to Ukraine per capita is among the highest of NATO allies. Just how long will you and other NATO members continue to fund this war?
Nobody wants more peace than Ukraine. Finland wants peace. Everybody wants peace. The only ones who do not want peace and who started the war in the first place is Russia. And unfortunately, the more you give in to Russian aggression, the more of the aggression you get. So it is, as said, our human duty to help the victims of this aggression and hope that one day Russia will come back to the international law-based, rules-based system and start adhering to the agreements that they have been signing themselves. And then we can be living happily in partnerships and friendship ever after.
But won't Russia feel more compelled to retaliate the more it feels encircled by NATO member states and their military bases?
Again, NATO is not encircling anybody. NATO does not expand by force. The way NATO expands is in the example of Finland and Sweden, that free people in democratic nations choose to join and not to attack another country. Finland has never been a threat to Russia. We are not a threat to Russia within NATO either. NATO is a defensive alliance. And the only reason we are joining NATO and have joined NATO is because we want to be protected. We want to live in peace and happiness. Well, Finland is the happiest country in the world. We would like the Russians to be happy as well, and live a democratic life and choose on their own behalf how they want to live their life on the other side of the border, of course. So that would be my answer. And in this very same manner, it was not Ukraine who provoked anything. Ukraine was not threatening Russia. Perhaps Russia feels, the truth is, threatened by the fact that in neighboring countries people can live freely and be very, very happy and also prosper, contrary to what it's like in Russia.
Alongside NATO membership, Finland signed a bilateral agreement with the United States, giving the US access to some 15 sites across Finland. By allowing the US to position itself so close to the Russian border, could Helsinki be allowing itself to become a pawn in what is effectively seen by many as a proxy war between the United States and NATO on the one hand and Russia on the other?
We are only protecting ourselves together with our partners and our allies. And of course, the United States is a very important ally to us. And again, we are staying on this side of the border. We hope the Russians do the same.
Foreign Minister Valtonen, many thanks.
Thank you so much.
So how long can the West sustain its commitment to Ukraine following Donald Trump's recent re-election? And can there be a military solution to the conflict? William Courtney is a former American diplomat who has served as a US representative in Eastern Europe. Ambassador Courtney, there is talk now that President-elect Trump may be willing to push for a political settlement in Ukraine. How likely is that to happen?
A political settlement will take a lot of negotiating on both sides. There is no sign that either Russia or Ukraine is close to the point of negotiating a political settlement. Usually political settlements don't begin to be negotiated until both sides are exhausted from fighting, and that's not yet the case. In Yugoslavia, for example, in the 1990s, both sides in the Bosnia War were exhausted, and so it was possible to do that. So in the absence of a political settlement, usually a ceasefire or armistice is more feasible than a political settlement.
Well, it's been reported that Trump has said that Ukraine is ready to accept some form of a peace agreement. What kind of shape will it take? Will it have to include neutrality for Ukraine?
This would very much depend on negotiations. Because Western support for Ukraine is so strong, and because Ukraine understands that without Western support, it would be vulnerable to Russian invasion at any moment, neutrality seems quite unlikely. Neutrality typically is for smaller states, not for larger states.
But whatever military support Ukraine keeps getting from Western allies, is it in a position today to impose its own conditions? Can it refuse this key demand that Russia has had since the war began and before the war started, that Ukraine should not be a member of NATO?
Ukraine has made quite clear, President Zelensky has said over and over, that Ukraine needs security guarantees. Joining NATO is the best way to obtain a Western security guarantee. Bilateral security guarantees are also possible. In 1960, the US and Japan negotiated a bilateral security agreement. But in the context of where Ukraine is in Europe, joining NATO is the most likely form of a security guarantee.
What do you make of the Biden push to provide Ukraine with $20 billion in additional aid and military support before the end of Biden's term?
This is something that's been planned for quite some time. The United States and Europe together are providing $50 billion, which are monies that come from the earnings from impounded, frozen Russian central bank assets. So this is just the U.S. share has been 20, and I think the European share is about $30 billion. But this has been in the works, in plan for a long time.
But is it helpful? Is it a wise strategy to adopt?
Yes, it is, because Ukraine needs financial support as well as military support from the West.
Do you believe, though, that Ukraine can defeat Russia militarily, no matter how much aid and support it gets from NATO members?
Ukraine certainly is in a position, as we have seen now, to fight Russia to a standstill. So, for example, at the beginning of the war 2.5 years ago, the Russians thought they were going to win quickly. Well, it turned out that Ukraine has been able to fight successfully and hold off Russia. So Russia has really gained very little territory since the initial territory it gained in the spring of 2022. Ukrainians are fighting effectively. They're using Western military equipment more effectively than the Iraqis did or the Afghans did. So Ukraine has actually been a pretty effective combatant.
But can it ever defeat Russia militarily?
It's hard to know what would happen. It's hard to know what Russia will do itself. So, for example, the last time Moscow invaded a neighbor was in the 1980s when it fought a war in Afghanistan, which then was a neighbor to the Soviet Union. That ended in a total withdrawal by the Soviet Union after a regime change in which a liberalizing leader, Mikhail Gorbachev, came to power and wanted to reduce the military burden. Right now, it looks like Russia is spending a lot of money. Its economy is suffering a lot, and it's taking high battlefield casualties. So we should not rule out the possibility that Russia will pull out at some point as one of the options.
How much of a proxy war is this, though, between the United States and Russia, with the US trying to achieve its long-term aim, strategic aim, of defeating Russia?
It's not a proxy war in the traditional sense in which the US or Russia would go into a war thinking that the purpose of entering the war was to weaken the opponent. This became a proxy war in some sense because Russia invaded Ukraine and the West came to Ukraine's support. So the Western idea was never to fight Russia or to reduce Russia's military power. It was to protect Ukraine.
But this isn't ultimately about protecting Ukraine, is it? It's about defeating and overcoming Russia's influence in the region, isn't it?
No, that's not true. If Russia were to pull out of Ukraine today, the West would no longer be, waging an effort to support Ukraine to fight Russia. So a Russian pullout would solve the problem.
And would a commitment from Zelensky not to join NATO also solve the problem?
Probably not, because Russia would demand to occupy territory that it has now, to occupy that in perpetuity. And Russia might make other demands, such as neutrality, for example. So most likely, the issue of Ukraine's not joining NATO, that most likely is not ever going to be agreed by Ukraine.
What is happening in Syria could have huge military and political implications for Russia. How do you see things playing out there and affecting the ongoing war in Ukraine?
Well, the loss of Russia's long-term, half a century closest ally in the Middle East is a huge geopolitical blow to Moscow. It raises questions whether Russia is a reliable supporter of its allies. It is a political blow to the Putin regime, probably to President Putin himself. It may undercut confidence in Moscow that Russia is on the right course in waging war on Ukraine. Again, because supporters of the war in Russia thought that the war was going to be ended quickly, and it's turned into a long-term stalemate. That's been frustrating for hardliners in Moscow.
Ambassador William Courtney, thank you very much for joining me.
You're quite welcome.
While Russia may have suffered a strategic setback in Syria, it isn't clear if it will have any impact on its ability to fight a long war in Ukraine and achieve its long-term objectives. But questions remain. How long can Western nations like Finland sustain their commitment to Ukraine? Will Helsinki's increasing role within NATO enhance regional security, or will it risk leading the alliance into direct military conflict with Russia? For now, NATO members are intent on continuing to provide Ukraine with heavy weapons and ammunition, adding fuel to a fire that continues to burn with no end in sight. From me, Rida Fakhri, and the team, thanks for watching.